The key to the Fenwick shipyard was taken from Caroline before the men who had watched her grow from a child among bolts of canvas and coils of rope. Her elder brother Edward held out his hand in the sail loft at the very hour the yard bell usually called the cutters to work. Behind him stood Nathaniel Fenwick, pale and solemn in a new black coat, and Mr. Sorrel, the family solicitor, with a leather case tucked beneath one arm. No one looked at the long cutting floor where Caroline had served for 14 years. Their eyes remained on the brass key at her waist and on the folded confession upon the table. 7 men had drowned when the Mercy Belle foundered off Darnwick Head 3 weeks earlier. Her foresail had split before she struck the reef, and Edward had told the harbor inquiry that Caroline's stitching must have failed. He did not mention that he had ordered her finished sail removed on the night before departure. Nathaniel swore that no substitution had occurred. The inquiry accepted the testimony of 2 prosperous shipbuilders over that of an unmarried woman who worked for them. Now Edward offered her £50 if she signed a statement admitting that grief over their father's death had made her careless. Caroline read the confession once. Then she laid it beside her father's brass rule. "I did not make the sail that tore." Edward's public sympathy vanished. "Then you leave with nothing." Mr. Sorrel cleared his throat and produced a second paper. Their father's will divided his property unevenly, the operating yard and its contracts to his sons, an abandoned sail loft on Saltmarsh Lane to Caroline. It stood beyond the prosperous quay, burdened with £11 in unpaid rates and condemned as unsafe. Her brothers called it a generous provision. The workmen understood the joke. Rain had taken half its slates, the tide flooded its approach, and no sail had been cut there in 20 years. Caroline signed the deed of assent, not the confession. She packed her awl, palm guard, needles, chalk reel, shears, and the brass rule her father had taught her to read before she could write a proper hand. At the door, she turned toward the workers. "The seams I sewed are in the yard book. If any man is told otherwise, he may ask to see them." Edward ordered the bell rung. Hammers began before she crossed the quay, drowning whatever answer courage might have drawn from the men. Saltmarsh Lane ended in brown reeds and a black ribbon of tide. The old loft leaned above a stone undercroft, its weatherboards silvered by salt, and its northern roof open to the November sky. One gable faced the harbor, the other looked across mudflats toward Darnwick Head. A demolition notice hung crookedly from the door. Caroline opened the lock with the iron key Mr. Sorrel had given her and smelled wet timber, mouse nests, tar, and canvas gone sour with mildew. Her inheritance contained a cracked stove, 2 benches, a vast cutting floor, and rolls of cloth too rotten to lift. She found one sound corner beneath the western eaves and stretched oilskin above it. As she cleared a place for her blanket, she noticed a narrow strip of blue canvas under a batten. Rats had eaten the surrounding sailcloth to lace, but had left this strip untouched. It was coated with bitter copper preservative, a treatment her father had forbidden for working sails because it stiffened the fibers. Along its edge ran groups of stitches, 2 long, 1 short, 3 long, 1 short, 2 long. They were not strengthening stitches. They were Elias Fenwick's private cutting marks, used when Caroline was a girl to teach her how a curved sail could be described without written figures. She carried the strip to the floor. Hundreds of copper tack holes punctured the boards beneath dirt and old tar. Some formed the familiar sweep of a schooner's foresail. Others crossed it at a sharper angle, as if a second pattern had been laid over the first. Outside, mud sucked at a boot. Caroline shuttered her lamp and waited. The door moved against its latch, then stopped. By the time she reached it, the lane was empty. Yet a fresh heel mark led toward the quay, and the demolition notice had been torn neatly through its nail. The first night taught her what condemned meant after sunset. Wind entered through the northern roof and lifted the oilskin above her bed with the slow breath of a living thing. Every loose board became a footstep. The tide reached the undercroft arches near midnight and set fragments of wood knocking beneath the floor. Caroline slept in her cloak with the tool chest under one hand. Twice she woke certain that someone stood beyond the partition, but but her lamp revealed only cobweb and the pale edge of ruined canvas. At first light, she measured the property. The loft was 84 feet long and 27 wide, with a stone undercroft projecting 4 feet farther toward the marsh than the timber walls above. She recorded every dimension in her work diary. Elias had taught all 3 children arithmetic, but only Caroline enjoyed writing a measure twice, once as observed, once as verified. Edward called it hesitation. Her father called it respect for material. She found an old sign beneath the stairs: Larkin and Fenwick, sailmakers and riggers. Elias had spoken little of Larkin except to say partnerships failed when one man valued speed over proof. Salt had darkened the planed-away letters deeply enough to survive. Caroline set the sign against the wall rather than burn it. A past someone had tried to erase was already more useful than firewood. Food presented a less poetic problem. She traded 2 hours of mending at the chandlery for bruised potatoes, saved rainwater in a clean sail tub, and learned to coax the cracked stove without smoking herself from the room. Each arrangement opposed Edward's story that a woman capable of fine stitching could not manage property, accounts, customers, or danger. Pride could not patch a roof, but orderly work could keep cold from becoming disaster. At dawn, she learned the practical measure of her fortune. The rate collector would allow 6 weeks before seeking an order of sale. A carpenter named Amos Reed judged the eastern stairs dangerous and the roof beyond Caroline's means. He was willing to brace 1 room for 12 shillings if she helped. His daughter Bess, a quiet girl of 16, carried his tools and stared at Caroline's sailmaker's palm as though it were a medal. "My mother says you spoiled the Mercy Belle's sail," Bess said when Amos went below. "Your mother heard what powerful men paid to have repeated." Caroline placed a hand upon a beam. "This, however, is honestly spoiled." Bess smiled despite herself. For 3 days they cleared rot, caught rain in buckets, and fixed tarred canvas over the western roof. Caroline sold brass scraps for 4 shillings and spent 3 on coal, bread, and lamp oil. She kept a written account down to the last penny. At low tide she inspected the undercroft. Its seaward wall carried painted flood marks, but the highest stopped 2 feet below the floor. The ruin had not failed from tide alone. Water entered through a broken valley gutter and traveled inside the wall. The undercroft held signs of earlier industry. Numbered iron hooks crossed the ceiling, and channels in the stone floor sloped toward a trap drain. A brick pier enclosed a thumb-wide copper tube rising into the cutting room. When Caroline blew air through it, blue lint appeared above. The tube had once carried a cord for transferring measurements between floors. It explained how the old partners could prepare cloth above while testing miniature rigs below, and why the loft extended beyond its visible walls. Amos sounded each eastern joist with his chisel handle and marked 3 with crosses. 1 had been sawn nearly through, then disguised with tar. "Rot phrase," he said. "A saw leaves a promise." Caroline tied the passage shut. Recovering patterns could wait. Making the building safe for Bess could not. Competence was not solving the most interesting problem first. It was refusing to let curiosity create another victim. Her training had begun with thread, but Elias had insisted that a sailmaker must understand the whole path of force, from wind through cloth to mast, hull, and sea. Caroline traced the roof load in the same way. She and Amos opened a blocked lead channel, fitted a wooden chute, and saved the western room. In return for Caroline mending the sails of his brother's fishing smack, Amos delayed half his fee. The bargain gave her shelter, but not innocence. On the 4th evening, Bess swept the cutting floor, and uncovered paired chalk grooves protected beneath a fallen bench. One was white, the other held blue pigment. The blue line matched the preserved strip. Caroline stretched her chalk cord between tack holes. The first pattern described the foresail she had made for the Mercy Belle. A broad curve, balanced reef points, and reinforcing patches where strain would gather. The second narrowed the head and shifted the clew downward. Such a sail would pull hard in ordinary wind, but twist under a sudden change, loading one seam until it opened. "Why would anyone cut that?" Bess asked. "To make a ship appear swift during trials," Caroline said, "or to make failure look like the cutter's fault." The altered pattern was incomplete. Several boards had been replaced, and the crucial lower corner disappeared under a partition erected after the Loft ceased trading. Caroline examined the nails. The partition looked old, but its square, machine-cut nails were no more than 5 years in place. Someone had built it to conceal part of the floor. She tested an innocent explanation before accusing anyone. Merchants often altered lofts to make dry stores, and recent nails proved only that the wall was recent. Bess found an invoice pasted inside a cupboard for partition timber purchased by Fenwick brothers 18 months earlier. Caroline copied it, then returned it exactly where it had survived. If the original disappeared, her copy would be called invention. If both remained, their agreement became fact. The lines demanded equal caution. A pattern might be experimental without being criminal. Caroline made paper reductions and pinned them to cloth. The blue form produced speed and steady air, but a hand model could not reproduce the weight of a ship. Until she found test records or conducted a fair trial, they possessed a warning, not a verdict. Bess confessed she had asked for an apprenticeship at the Fenwick yard and been refused because women distracted men. Caroline showed her a herringbone patch. The girl's first line wandered, and Caroline made her unpick it without ridicule. A crooked, hidden stitch transferred strain into neighboring cloth. By sunset, the second attempt lay flat, the first new work completed in the loft for 20 years. That afternoon, Edward arrived in a hired carriage that sank to its hubs in the lane. He wore concern like a well-cut coat. He offered Caroline £75 for the loft, explaining that the town planned to clear unsafe buildings. She asked why worthless boards interested him. His gaze traveled once toward the partition. "Father should never have burdened you with this place," he said. "Father did nothing without a measure." Edward's mouth tightened. He warned her that another vessel, the Providence, would sail in 12 days carrying emigrant families and Fenwick canvas. If she spread accusations, she would injure the yard and every man employed there. Caroline replied that if the canvas was honest, truth could not injure it. After he left, she found blue fibers caught on the mud of his boot print, the same copper-treated canvas hidden beneath her floor batten. Caroline went to the harbor office with her old work diary. Harbor Master Gideon Pike listened, but refused to detain the Providence on a theory. The official yard book showed that Caroline had cut and finished the Mercy Belle's foresail. Her private diary showed the same. Neither proved which sail had been installed. Edward had produced the torn sail's headboard after the wreck, marked with Caroline's initials. Pike allowed her to examine it in the evidence store. The letters CF had been burned into the ashwood with her own stamp, yet the lacing holes were set by a 6-to-the-inch gauge, while Caroline had used 7 for every Fenwick schooner after her father showed her how the smaller spacing distributed strain. Beneath the tar, she found a shallow crescent from a knife slipping against the grain. Nathaniel bore such a scar across his left thumb from the day he first cut a headboard alone. It was suggestive, not proof. Pike let her review the inquiry inventory. 3 statements used the identical phrase, "failure arising from weak female stitching." Sailors did not speak that way, and one witness could not write. Edward's counsel had prepared them. Repeated words were not necessarily false, Pike said, but he no longer sounded certain. The weather log was objective. The headland station recorded a sharp northwesterly squall at 3:40. The Mercy Belle signaled distress 12 minutes later. Caroline copied the times. Someone had asked the wrong question at the inquiry. Whether a seam failed, not what forced it to bear. Then she compared the burned initials with her stamp. One corner of the C was blunted on the evidence headboard. Her stamp acquired that damage only after falling from a bench 2 days after the ship's departure. The mark had been applied later. Pike stopped treating her visit as a plea and sealed the headboard in a new evidence sack. On her return, the loft door stood open. Her papers had been scattered, and the preserved blue strip was gone. Nothing else of value had been touched. Bess found a torn end of tarred cord caught in the latch. Fenwick Yard issued that cord, but half the harbor used it. Caroline blamed herself for showing Edward what mattered. Amos advised her to take the money. His warning was not cowardice. Edward controlled repair contracts that fed 3 families related to him. Caroline understood the price of his help. She told him he could leave without owing her loyalty. Amos remained long enough to set the last brace. "A beam doesn't care whose name is painted on the cart," he said. "It holds if the joint is true." They removed the false partition board by board. Behind it lay the continuation of both patterns and a recessed cabinet faced with planks cut from the same floor. Its lock had rusted solid. Caroline noticed that the blue tack line passed directly across its door. No designer would interrupt a working pattern with storage unless the interruption itself recorded a measure. Using the distance between stitch groups on a scrap Bess had found, she set 3 sliding wooden pins beside the lock. The cabinet opened. Inside rested no gold, only 6 sailcloth templates wrapped around a zinc tube, a small model mast, and Elias Fenwick's notebook sealed in waxed canvas. The dry cabinet, ventilated through the stone undercroft, had preserved them. His pages described an adjustable storm sail, meant to reduce strain without forcing sailors aloft in dangerous weather. The paired floor patterns were experiments. White for the safe form, blue for an aggressive racing form Elias had rejected after a model twisted at the mast. The notebook began 9 years earlier, when a squall killed a rigger named Owen Bell as he climbed to shorten sail. Caroline recognized Mrs. Bell's family name but had never known her husband's death influenced Elias. He described watching owners praise courage while sending underpaid men into preventable danger. The adjustable design was meant to bring reefing lines within reach of the deck. Hugh Larkin supplied the old loft for private tests after Edward mocked the project as an invention for cowards. Entries revealed a long progression rather than sudden genius. Early canvas bunched at the foot. A wooden guide split. A weighted block struck Elias's shoulder and kept him from work for a month. Beside every failure, he named the person who spotted it. Larkin, a rigger, a rope maker, or young Caroline. Edward and Nathaniel appeared only when a trial produced enough speed to interest ship owners. They wanted to advertise the blue variation before it survived crosswinds. Elias refused and moved the records out of the main yard. Caroline remembered being 12 and holding a model line while her father changed its angle. She had thought the lesson merely a game. He had asked which cloth told the truth, the one that stood beautifully in gentle air, or the one that yielded without tearing in a gust. She answered the second. The memory now hurt because he had trusted her judgment long before he trusted her with his reasons. The last complete entry recorded a dispute. Edward threatened to use the design after Elias's death, arguing that family ownership made permission unnecessary. Elias responded by separating the old loft legally and encoding the safe work for a trained successor. He did not name that person in the notebook. Caroline felt both chosen and abandoned. Her father had prepared a defense, but left her to fight the battle alone. One page had been cut away. Another stated that the complete drawings, trust instrument, and test results had been lodged where every honest sail declares its maker. Caroline knew the phrase. Fenwick sails carried a narrow maker's tab sewn inside the lower corner. The Mercy Belle's recovered fragment lacked its tab. The Providence, due to depart in 8 days, was being fitted with a new foresail based on the same narrowed blue design. The notebook changed the mystery and deepened the danger. Elias had not hidden a fortune. He had hidden knowledge that could prevent a death. Yet his test model alone could not show that Edward had knowingly substituted the rejected sail. Caroline needed the missing page, the Mercy Belle's maker's tab, and evidence connecting the blue pattern to the current contract. For 2 nights she reconstructed Elias's method. The model mast fitted 3 sockets along a brass arc, allowing the angle of wind to change. Lead weights represented hull resistance. Reefing cords passed through numbered hooks below. Elias had designed the building as an instrument, The floor supplied full-scale geometry, the undercroft tested force, and the marsh supplied wind. Her first trial embarrassed her. She rigged the blue miniature too tightly and both patterns failed. Bess thought the experiment proved nothing. Caroline admitted expectation had guided her hands. They repeated it with equal tension measured by hanging weights. The white pattern flexed, the blue one locked at the head, twisted the mast, and snapped a telltale. Repetition produced the same result 3 times. Caroline recorded the failed first trial beside the others. Evidence cleansed of mistakes was another kind of fraud. The safe design also had a weakness. Its deck-controlled reefing line could jam when salt swelled the guide loops. Elias had withheld it for good reason. The invention was promising, not finished. Edward had mistaken a rejected variation for a profitable secret and ignored the patient labor between an idea and a safe product. She began earning openly. Fishermen brought storm-damaged jibs after Amos displayed his repaired sail. Caroline worked beneath the patched roof from first light until the lamp smoked at night. Bess learned to wax thread and follow a seam without puckering it. Caroline charged fairly, recorded every payment, and refused work she could not finish safely. A widow named Mrs. Belle brought soup and said her drowned son had served aboard the Mercy Belle. She did not offer forgiveness. She asked only whether Caroline was certain. Her first customer was Jacob Hume, whose small smack had lost a jib. He expected her to accept half a crown because she needed work. Caroline examined the cloth and quoted 4 shillings, explaining the patch, bolt rope, and hours required. When he objected, she showed how a cheaper repair would fail. He paid 3 shillings and promised the 4th after his next catch. 2 days later he returned with the coin and another fisherman. Reputation entered by the same door Rumor had used, but more slowly and carrying evidence. Caroline divided each payment among food, fuel, rates, and materials. By week's end, the rate jar held £1 7 shillings, far short of £11, but enough to make debt measurable rather than shapeless. Not everyone changed. A chandlery owner refused credit. Children called wreck stitcher from the lane. One customer withdrew his sale after Edward's clerk visited him. Community was not a crowd won by a brave speech. It was Jacob returning with his coin, Bess bringing straight stitches, and Amos checking a brace twice because lives rested on it. "Certain enough to risk my own name," Caroline answered. "Names are not lives," Mrs. Belle said. "Find what is." The rebuke steadied her. Caroline compared Elias's model with weather reports preserved at the harbor office. The Mercy Belle had met a hard northwesterly shift just before the sail split. In that change, the blue pattern would twist exactly as the survivor's brief statements described. One survivor existed, cabin boy Thomas Vale, recovering at his aunt's cottage inland. Edward had told the inquiry that the boy was delirious and remembered nothing. Caroline walked 6 miles through cold rain to see him. Thomas remembered a lantern at the shipyard after midnight and 2 men changing a bundled sail. He could not identify them, but one had dropped a bright brass tally stamped 47. Caroline knew the tallies assigned outgoing work. Number 47 belonged to Nathaniel's fitting crew. Thomas had hidden it from fear and now gave it to her. He also remembered the mate cutting away a small corner of the torn sail before the vessel sank. The mate had thrust it into a tin dispatch case, saying the maker's mark would tell the truth. The case had not appeared among recovered effects. Thomas was 14, with healing rope burns across both palms. His aunt interrupted whenever his breathing shortened. Caroline did not ask him to recount the drowning men. She asked about objects, the bundle's color, the seal, the lanterns, the sound when the sail was hoisted. Concrete questions let him answer without reliving the whole terror. The replacement canvas smelled bitter and left blue dust. Nathaniel said it was for a trial and gave Thomas a penny to be silent. In the squall, the upper corner pulled sideways before the seam opened. The mate cursed, "The false clue," words Thomas understood only when Caroline showed him her paper models. When she asked if he would repeat this to Pike, Thomas shook. Outside, Caroline recognized the temptation to treat a necessary witness as a tool. She returned and said he owed her nothing. If he chose to speak, Pike could visit with his aunt present. Thomas handed her tally 47 only after that promise. Trust freely given might arrive too late, but coerced truth would repeat the injustice she opposed. On the return road, a cart forced Caroline against a ditch. She recognized Nathaniel holding the reins. He stopped and apologized with exaggerated alarm. Then he offered to take her home. She refused and walked the remaining miles with a bleeding palm, protecting the tally inside her bodice. At the loft, she found the cabinet emptied and Elias's notebook missing. Bess lay stunned near the stairs, a bruise at her temple. She had surprised a masked intruder and clutched a scrap torn from his coat. Caroline sent for the doctor before examining the loss. The templates and model remained. Only the notebook had gone. Her own notes, hidden in the stove's cold ash drawer, preserved the essential measurements. Bess woke before midnight and begged Caroline not to tell Amos she had failed. Caroline answered that courage was not guarding cloth at the cost of one's skull. She spent 5 of her remaining 9 shillings on the doctor. When Amos arrived, grief became anger, first at Caroline, then at the men who assumed poor families could be frightened without consequence. He took Bess home and said he would not return. The next morning, a court messenger served Caroline with notice that Edward had purchased the unpaid rate debt and sought possession. The hearing would occur in 4 days. Demolition men marked the eastern wall in red. Edward had advanced from rumor to purchase, theft, and law, always keeping another hand between himself and the act. The petition also called the loft a public danger. If the magistrates agreed, Edward could demolish it and charge the cost against the property. The red mark crossed stones enclosing the dry cabinet vent. Destruction would erase the testing room and the reason its papers survived. The town's principal builder declined an independent survey after receiving a Fenwick contract. Retired mason Agnes Pritchard came instead. Though unable to sign an official report, she showed Caroline that hard new cement trapped water beside older lime mortar and produced the alarming bow. Remove that strip, brace the opening, and the wall could wait until spring. They worked through sleet. Caroline paid Agnes 2 shillings and kept a cement sample. Beneath it appeared the date EF 1853, and a boundary cross proving the stones belonged to the original loft, not the town embankment, as Edward claimed. Bess copied the mark before the brace covered it. Repair had made the property both safer and legally clearer. Caroline could pay neither the debt nor a solicitor. She considered selling her father's brass rule, then saw the tiny corrections he had scratched beside its inch marks after years of checking swollen wooden measures. A trustworthy measure had to be compared against something fixed. The thought sent her back to the trust phrase. Where every honest sale declares its maker, she examined the 6 preserved templates. Each had a maker's tab sewn inside its lower corner. When arranged by date, the tabs contained not merely Elias's name but groups of tiny eyelets. Caroline placed them against the brass rule. Their spacing formed references. Yard book number, page, and entry. The last template pointed to Book 3, page 118. That page in the official book recorded the sale of the old loft to Elias's former partner, Hugh Larkin, 20 years ago. A later note claimed Larkin surrendered it for debt. Yet the deed Mr. Sorrel had given Caroline traced title directly from Elias. Both could not be true. Mr. Sorrel received her reluctantly. Faced with the inconsistent entry, he admitted that Elias had bought Larkin's share but placed the loft under a separate covenant. Sorrel's late father prepared it. The covenant required any profits from Elias's storm sail invention to support injured harbor workers and their families. Control belonged to the child who could prove mastery of the encoded templates. Edward and Nathaniel had searched for the instrument after Elias died, believing it carried valuable patent rights. Sorrel claimed ignorance of its location. "Why did you not disclose the covenant at probate?" Caroline asked. "Because no instrument was found. And your brothers assured me the invention failed. You accepted the assurance of the men who benefited from its disappearance? His silence confessed professional timidity. Caroline demanded a certified copy of the old index reference. He refused until she placed Thomas's tally on his desk and described Bess's injury. Sorel finally opened a locked drawer. Elias had left him a sealed memorandum to be delivered if any child discovered the template code. It named Caroline as intended steward, not because she was his daughter, but because she alone had completed the full sailmaker's apprenticeship. The memorandum directed her to the Loft's first honest customer. Hugh Larkin had been the first customer. He was dead, but his cutter, the Resolute, lay abandoned in the upper creek. Its sails had long vanished. Caroline searched the Loft invoices and found that Elias's first maker's tab had been sewn not into canvas, but into the leather cover of Larkin's sale account, later donated to the Mariner's reading room. The account had been catalogued as worthless trade arithmetic. The search consumed a day. Old invoices had swollen together, and separating them too quickly would strip ink from paper. Caroline warmed the room, placed blotting sheets between pages, and waited. Preservation, like sailmaking, required knowing when force caused loss. One invoice charged nothing for the first tab by agreement. Another named a bookbinder on Church Row. His widow remembered Elias requiring the lining fixed only around its edges. She also remembered Edward asking about the account before Elias died. Edward knew a document existed, but not which customer received it. That explained his searches and the false partition. He was hunting a secret he did not fully understand. Dozens of account books filled an uncatalogued shelf at the reading room. Caroline used the tiny sail emblem impressed on the templates to identify Larkin's volume. Without the code, it looked like ordinary arithmetic. The hiding place relied on abundance, neglect, and a successor who knew the craft, not miraculous preservation or luck. Mrs. Belle kept the reading room key. She brought Caroline to a cupboard of salt-warped volumes and watched as she opened the Larkin account. Beneath the leather lining lay a parchment covenant, an embossed design registration, and a packet of test reports witnessed by 2 naval architects. Elias had hidden the documents where the code would lead a trained successor, safe from sons interested only in immediate contracts. The covenant granted the Loft an invention to a charitable trust once its steward demonstrated the complete safe pattern. Until then, the property remained Caroline's personal inheritance. Its clauses were cautious. At least half of net income must aid harbor workers injured through no fault of their own. 3 trustees were required: the qualified steward, a sailor's representative, and one chosen by bereaved or injured families. No yard owner could control more than 1 vote. Elias had built distrust of concentrated power into the instrument. The design registration still had 7 years because Elias filed an improvement shortly before his death. Caroline might have escaped Darnwick by licensing it privately, but accepting stewardship ended that choice. It also explained her brother's fear. A successful trust would compete with them and demand independent inspection. Mrs. Belle read the clauses twice. Your father knew workers paid for owner's haste. He knew and still left the papers hidden while Edward took the yard? The emotional truth did not flatter Elias. He had seen his son's ambition but postponed the conflict until after death. His cleverness burdened the child he trusted most. Caroline allowed herself anger. Loving her father did not require mistaking secrecy for justice. One report described the rejected blue sail and warned that its altered clue could cause catastrophic twist. Across the final page, Elias had written that Edward, then a young salesman, wanted the faster-looking design for trial races. Elias forbade its use. The history established knowledge and motive, but not the recent substitution. Mrs. Belle touched the packet without taking it. This may clear your name. It does not tell me what happened to my son. No, Caroline said. For that, I need the tab from the wreck. The tide charts gave one chance. Wreckage from the Mercy Belle had drifted toward an old customs boom below Darnwick Head. Amos returned while Caroline prepared to search, carrying Bess's torn coat scrap. Its cloth matched the uniform issued to Fenwick night watchman. Bess, pale but upright, came behind him. She had remembered the intruder smelling of clove oil, used by Silas Mott, Edward's foreman, for a bad tooth. Amos did not apologize for leaving. He offered his boat. At low water, they searched among weed-covered stakes. Caroline understood how canvas moved when water filled and released it. A floating case would snag leeward of the boom, not where the harbor crews had dragged. Under a mat of eelgrass, she found a dented tin dispatch box. Inside, wrapped in the mate's neckcloth, lay the Mercy Belle's maker's tab and a note written as the vessel took water. The tab bore Nathaniel's 6-to-the-inch eyelets and tally 47, not Caroline's 7-to-the-inch code. The mate's note stated that the sail had arrived sealed from Fenwick Yard after midnight, and that its distorted pull prevented the ship from clearing the reef. On their way back, men from Edward's yard intercepted the boat. Silas Mott demanded the case under authority of the ship's owners. Amos refused. In the struggle, Mott knocked the case into the creek. Bess caught its leather strap with a boat hook. Harbor Master Pike, alerted by Mrs. Belle, arrived in the patrol launch before Mott could try again. Pike arrested him for assault and interference with wreck evidence. Under questioning, Mott admitted entering the loft and stealing the notebook. Edward had ordered him to find the covenant. Nathaniel had ordered the sail substitution. Each brother had assumed the other would carry the greater blame. Pike separated Mott from the Fenwick men and took his statement twice. In the first, Mott claimed Nathaniel acted alone. In the second, faced with the partition invoice, he admitted Edward paid him to search the loft after Elias's funeral. He had erected the false wall to conceal fresh damage when he failed to open the floor cabinet. Months later, he sawed the eastern joists so any new owner would abandon the building. Edward never told him to injure Caroline, Mott insisted. He merely said the loft must become unusable. That distinction appalled Pike more than an open threat. Orders arranged to preserve deniability could still produce a body. Mott also confessed to taking the blue strip and later the notebook, but he denied striking Bess. He had shoved her when she caught his coat and she fell against the stair rail. His effort to reduce guilt supplied the precise detail only the intruder could know. Caroline listened without triumph. Mott's wife and children depended on his wages, just as Amos's family depended on contracts. Edward had built a chain in which each person was encouraged to pass danger downward. Yet poverty did not erase Mott's choices. Caroline asked Pike to ensure Bess's injury appeared in the charge, and refused Mott's offer to recover the burned notebook in exchange for mercy. The tin case remained sealed until Mrs. Belle and Thomas arrived. Pike read the mate's final note aloud only with their consent. It named the men who kept their stations and described the sail's pull without melodrama. Mrs. Belle asked for a copy, not the original. The evidence belonged in public custody. Her son's courage belonged to memory. But the Providence was scheduled to depart the following morning, and its papers declared its sails approved. Pike could delay it only on evidence of immediate danger. The confiscated Fenwick notebook had already been burned in the yard furnace. Caroline still had Elias's templates and her measurements, but to demonstrate the danger she needed a full reconstruction. The loft became a workshop through the night. Amos brought battens. Bess laid chalk lines. Fishermen whom Caroline had served without cheating carried lamps and canvas. Even Mrs. Belle took a needle, though she had not yet forgiven anyone. Using the preserved safe templates, Caroline cut a reduced demonstration sail and rigged it to Elias's model mast. Beside it, she cut the blue version from her recorded floor measurements. At dawn, a hard wind came across the mudflats. The safe sail spilled the gust through its adjustable reefing bands. The blue sail twisted, dragged the mast sideways, and tore precisely along the overloaded seam. The work nearly failed before midnight. Moisture swelled the model's reefing guides, confirming the flaw Caroline had noticed. Nathaniel's counsel could argue any difference came from faulty equipment. She dried the guides and replaced two with horn rings cut by Jacob, documenting the alteration before Pike and 3 witnesses. The test would establish the blue pattern's danger, not pretend the white design was perfect. They used equal cloth, thread, mast angles, and weights. Bess numbered every component. Mrs. Belle sealed the knots after Caroline tied them. Amos built a windboard so Pike could read direction without taking Caroline's word. By 3, exhaustion made her hands tremble. Bess took the needle and finished the final straight seam under supervision. The apprenticeship had ceased to be charity. Caroline genuinely needed her skill. When the blue model failed, no one cheered. Mrs. Belle stared at the tear as though hearing again the moment her son was lost. Caroline stopped until the widow chose to continue. Proof belonged to the bereaved as much as to the accused. Pike watched both trials and impounded the Providence's foresail. Its panels matched the blue template. Hidden inside the lower corner was a 6-eyelet tab with Nathaniel's tally. The ship remained at berth. 112 passengers were removed before the weather worsened at noon. The rate hearing moved to the harbor assembly room because half the town demanded entry. Edward arrived with counsel and presented himself as a grieving employer victimized by his sister's obsession. Nathaniel blamed Mott. Caroline did not ask the magistrates to trust her character. She gave them a chain they could test. Her dated work diary, the yard's tally allocation, Thomas Vale's brass 47, the recovered maker's tab, the mate's note, Elias's witnessed warning, the 2 floor patterns, and the Providence sail seized before departure. She demonstrated the different eyelet gauges with her father's rule. Sorel produced the covenant and admitted withholding the memorandum. His admission injured his reputation, but saved what remained of his honor. Mott testified that Edward had sought the hidden papers while Nathaniel supervised the substitutions. Edward's flaw completed the case. Confident that trade records belonged only to owners, he had preserved every profitable invoice. Pike produced an invoice charging the Providence's owners for Special Racing Modification B, the same designation found on the rejected test report. Edward had signed it. Edward's counsel attacked the covenant as an eccentric scheme, and Caroline as a daughter inventing codes. She asked the magistrate to choose any template and eyelet group. Its corresponding account entry appeared without exception. Agnes testified to the boundary mark. The bookbinder's widow identified the hollow lining. The naval architect's signatures matched public harbor plans. No single discovery carried the case. Independent pieces supported one another. Nathaniel claimed Caroline planted tally 47. Thomas entered with his aunt. Pike began with lanterns and canvas rather than deaths. Thomas identified the bitter preservative and repeated the mate's words, false clue. Nathaniel laughed that a cabin boy could not understand geometry. His contempt undid his caution. Thomas replied that he understood the deck leaning beneath him. Mr. Cray, the chandlery owner who refused Caroline credit, produced his sales book. Nathaniel had purchased copper preservative, blue pigment, and 6-to-the-inch eyelets 2 days before the Mercy Belle sailed. Cray remained skeptical of Caroline, but he would not alter a dated account. His evidence mattered precisely because he was not her friend. The magistrates dismissed the rate claim after finding that Edward purchased the debt to obstruct evidence and referred the wreck matter for criminal prosecution. Nathaniel was charged with falsifying safety records and conspiracy. Edward with conspiracy, fraud, and attempting to suppress evidence. Their shipyard entered receivership. Compensation could not restore 7 lives, but its assets were placed under claims from the dead men's families and endangered passengers. Sorel faced professional discipline and agreed to serve the new trust without fee until independent trustees could be appointed. The ruling on the Loft required a separate chain. Mr. Sorel's deed, the covenant, the 1853 boundary mark, rate records, and Larkin's witnessed account were entered together. The magistrates confirmed Caroline's title pending formation of the trust and prohibited demolition. When Edward's counsel argued that a woman could not administer an industrial design, the registration clerk produced examples of patents held by women and reminded him that the covenant asked for demonstrated competence, not social approval. Caroline then assembled Elias's model from memory in full view of the court. She did not receive the Fenwick shipyard. That property belonged to creditors and claimants, and taking it would have confused justice with reward. Nor did every lost contract return. Owners who preferred cheap speed continued to call her troublesome. What she gained was narrower and stronger. Legal control of the loft, custody of the safe design, the right to earn from her own labor, and a public record stating she had not made the fatal sale. Outside the assembly room, workers from the yard waited without knowing whether they would have employment next week. Caroline could not promise to save them. She offered paid temporary work securing the loft and cataloging the seized sale stock once the receiver permitted it. 6 accepted. Others blamed her for the receivership and walked away. She let them go. Restoration built from compulsory gratitude would be another false seam. Caroline's name was formally cleared in the harbor record. Mrs. Belle stood when the finding was read, but did not applaud. She approached Caroline afterward and said, "Now make the truth useful." It was a harder commission than revenge, and exactly the one Caroline wanted. Winter did not transform the ruined loft by magic. Its eastern roof remained open until spring. Caroline used the modest registration royalties and income from repair work to pay the £11 rates, settle Amos's account, and buy sound second-hand slate. The trust hired local labor at posted wages. Its first payments went to the Mercy Belle families, then to a fund for injured sailors. Caroline refused to take money from their portion. She earned a steward's wage approved by Mrs. Belle and 2 elected harbor representatives. The first budget was sobering. A full roof cost £93, masonry £28, glazing £11. Available trust income after family payments was £34. They repaired the west, boarded the east, and postponed cosmetics. Salvaged slate reduced spring costs. Caroline leased the dry undercroft to a rope merchant on condition that the testing channels remain accessible. Repair work paid wages while fees accumulated. The first trust meeting was contentious. Fishermen wanted immediate payments. Ship owners wanted exclusive access to the storm sale. Mrs. Belle insisted on independent trials. Caroline agreed, sacrificing income she needed. They published the test results and invited rivals to inspect the templates. Openness made imitation possible, but secrecy had already proved more dangerous. 3 owners withdrew rather than accept inspection. 2 smaller operators agreed. The first sea trial exposed the swollen guide loop problem in heavy spray. No one was hurt because Caroline required a backup sail and conservative route. She redesigned the guides in horn and bronze, then repeated trials across 4 months and 3 vessels. Only after 20 successful reef changes did the trust approve a limited license. Over 6 months, the western room became a working sail loft, the undercroft a dry store, and the repaired eastern bay a training floor. Bess completed an apprenticeship that no respectable yard had previously offered a girl. Thomas Vale learned to inspect maker's tabs and later served as the trust's first safety clerk. Amos designed roof braces that left the original cutting floor untouched. The white and blue tack lines remained visible beneath protective oil, teaching every apprentice that 2 shapes could appear nearly alike while carrying wholly different consequences. Caroline completed Elias's adjustable storm sail, but did not treat his design as scripture. Sea trials exposed a chafing fault near one reefing band. She corrected it, recorded the failure, and registered the improvement in both her name and the trust's. That honest revision would have pleased the father, who taught her that every measure must be checked against something fixed. Edward and Nathaniel were convicted the following year. Neither offered remorse without bargaining for mercy. The court imposed imprisonment and financial penalties. The receiver sold the Fenwick yard to a cooperative of its senior workers, subject to independent sale inspection. Some townspeople continued to say Caroline had destroyed her family. She learned not to spend her life pleading with those who preferred a comfortable lie. On the first anniversary of the wreck, 7 small brass plates were set into the loft's threshold, each bearing the name of a man lost from the Mercy Belle. Mrs. Belle placed the first. No speeches promised that justice had balanced grief. Afterward, the families ate together on the cutting floor, while autumn wind pressed at the repaired windows. At dusk, Caroline climbed to the western gable. Below her, the old yard bell rang under new ownership. In the loft, Bess corrected an apprentice's crooked seam. Thomas entered a sale number in the public register, and Amos complained cheerfully about wet boots on his clean stairs. The building no longer mirrored the judgment passed upon it. Its scars had become records, its emptiness useful space, and its weakness a lesson in how to distribute strain. Caroline laid her father's brass rule along the sill. Beyond the mudflats, a cutter turned safely through a rising wind beneath the storm sail she had completed. The cloth yielded where it must and held where it should. She watched until its lamp cleared Darnwick Head, then went downstairs to close the day's accounts in her own hand.